Thank you for coming this rainy night. My name is Bob Cobb. I'm director of the Rutgers Institute of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, which together with landscape architecture, the Eagleton Institute, the Blouskine School, and the Department of Human Ecology are sponsoring this exciting event tonight. For those of you who don't know us, the Institute, or EOAS as we call it, is a network that includes about 130 faculty from across 7 schools at Rutgers, focused on 2 themes. The fundamental scientific understanding of the Earth, which we call planetary exploration, and the use of that scientific understanding to advance the sustainability and resilience of our society, which is called planetary stewardship. And our speaker tonight, Billy Fleming, is here as our planetary stewardship distinguished lecturer. So Billy came up the road from Penn, where he directs the McHarg Center for Design.
Urbanism and Ecology.
Urbanism and Ecology.
Yeah, close enough.
He is a professor in the Department of Landscape Architecture there, where he is doing some really exciting and groundbreaking work on sort of rethinking the design industry and its role in building a more sustainable planet. Before coming to Penn, Billy did his PhD there in landscape architecture. Before that, he was at the White House Domestic Policy Council, where he worked on a variety of issues related to the urban agenda, including sort of interagency work on things like sustainable communities. Before that, he did a master's in city regional planning at the University of Texas, and he's originally from Arkansas, which is also where he did his undergraduate degree in landscape architecture. And he's here to give a talk on a topic that's very closely related to an event he organized at Penn last month. The topic tonight is Design and Green New Deal. His event last month ended up being a blockbuster event. I think he probably started it thinking it would have an audience around the size of this room and ended up having 1,000 people show up, plus an online audience that, at least the number of views, is several times larger. And he's really sort of, I think, one of the key thinkers around the Green New Deal and the built environment. So it's my great pleasure to welcome to speak to us today, Billy Fleming.
Thank you, Bob. Am I on here?
Yep.
Are these working? Okay. I just want to begin by thanking Bob and thanking everyone here at Rutgers for making this trip so wonderful so far. If I'm a little lethargic, it's because they've been running me around all over your very wet campus all day today, meeting like 100 people. I sat in on 2 studios, met a bunch of other people. It's been, if not the most productive, one of the most productive trips I've ever taken to a university, so my hat's off to Bob and his team for making that possible. You're catching me at kind of an interesting, well, I don't know, I think it's an interesting time. One, because I run a center named for Ian McHarg, who 50 years ago published a book called Design with Nature, that in landscape architecture and environmental planning completely changed the way the field thinks about and operates out in the world. It also happened to become one of the most canonical books of the environmental movement of the 60s and did many other things we can talk about in the Q&A. But as a part of that celebration, the University of Pennsylvania felt compelled to market with an event called Design with Nature Now, which we've just finally wrapped up. It includes an exhibition of works. You're looking at some shots here from our exhibit where one of your faculty members, Kate John Alder, was both a speaker and has an essay in a book that's actually just out about a week ago, marking that occasion. This was our opportunity, our sort of obligation, we think, to look at Ian's impact on the built environment over the last half century, and to ask, what have we learned over the last 50 years of designing with nature, and what does it mean to design with nature now in an era of climate change, which is a topic that was not, really around as an idea when Ian was doing his work in the 50s and 60s. That exhibit's now down. For those of you who know landscape architecture, this is Dirk Simmons looking at 2050 an energetic odyssey, a plan to decarbonize the whole of Northern Europe by building a clean energy system throughout the North Sea. It was part of the Paris talks and is not really moving forward, but is sort of like still in formation as an idea. This show has been torn out now at Penn, so we marked the occasion in sort of 3 ways. One was to hold a conference where Kate was a speaker, and many other people, including Jim Corner, Anu Mathur, Lori Olin, many others were there to talk about Ian's legacy and some of these contemporary projects. We mounted 3 sort of interrelated exhibitions. One was about Ian's life. It was biographical. One was a more interpretive piece of artwork from Laurel McSherry, formerly at Virginia Tech, now at Morgan State. And the third was a book called Design with Nature Now. This is Lori, and if you know Lori and Ann or you know landscape architecture, after drinking a lot and telling jokes and stories about Ian, pointing at some of the maps I think they worked on, or one of them worked on as a student or a faculty member there. But anyway, so the book now that sort of captures all of these commemorative activities came out about a week ago with the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy, where again, Kate has a chapter in here. This is done with Fritz Steiner, my dean, Richard Weller, my chair, and Karen McCloskey as a senior faculty member in the Department of Landscape Architecture. It's the first real project of the McHarg Center, which was put together as a part of these celebratory activities, both as like an instrument or a vehicle for marking this anniversary, but also because it was viewed as a way for us to begin to institutionalize some of the sponsored and funded research that existed for a while in the design school. I see a hand going up over there.
Yes, I must have left my hearing aid, so I can't hear you that.
Is this better? Okay. Yeah, sorry, I have 2 microphones, so they're like sliding all over the place. So anyway, so this is Design with Nature Now, the book. I'm not going to go into the details of it, mostly because I haven't seen a physical copy of it yet. I think it arrived at my house today. It's a thing that's now been endorsed on the back cover by Governor Jerry Brown, maybe the most progressive environmental governor of the last 30 or 40 years in the US, by Bill McKibben, also strangely by your former governor, Christine Todd Whitman, which we can talk about in the Q&A if you want about how that happened. And also, you know, so we've wrapped that up. That exhibit's now about to travel the world. It'll go to Beijing first. It'll go, we think, to Glasgow second. It'll go, we think, to Calgary third, and then we're not quite sure what happens to it after that. But we've also just finished this big event that Bob mentioned called Designing a Green New Deal. And you can see from the lineup there, I won't go through everyone, but one of the people is now on your faculty here at Rutgers, Naomi Klein, who I know has done a bunch of G&D events around campus already, is planning to do more, I think is involved in the climate symposium you have coming up next month. And really, if you look at that list, this is pretty much it. This is like the list with a couple exceptions of people who've been really pushing the Green New Deal conversation in the States over the last year and a half. You can see this is Varshini Prakash from the Sunrise Movement there, who somehow at the end of the day, and I have to correct Bob a little bit, he said 1,000. It was about 1,400 people who showed up for this thing, about 7,000 who watched it live. And that's many schools of design shut down their school for the day to live stream it so everyone could watch it in the lobby, so we're not quite sure how many people watched it. But this is Varsh leading everyone in the song, which is a thing organizers tend to do at events like this. You can see, if you know people in landscape architecture, there's Karen McCloskey, Francesca Amon, there's Naomi Klein, Nancy Levinson is in there somewhere from Places Journal. It was quite a group, and it was quite an event for us, mostly because schools of design in general, and the University of Pennsylvania in particular, don't do things like this. This was quite a sort of mishmash of political organizers and designers, which is not a thing that happens at Penn all that much. It was not a thing that was incredibly popular there as we were organizing it, and it's become much more popular as it sort of happened and became viewed as quite a success. And we took it on, in part, this feels weird to like have a quote for myself in here, but I was told I have to do this, not for this event, but for another event I gave with this quote in it. This is Nancy Levinson from Places, wanting to make sure I like name places in my talks. But it felt important for us to do this mostly because the Green New Deal, we viewed, or I viewed anyway, as the biggest design and environmental idea in a century in this country. And really until the middle of this year was something that was being developed without planners and designers at the table. So many of the folks on that list, many of the people who've been involved in the sort of ideation and policy development around the Green New Deal for the last year or so are very good at what they do. They're economists, they're technocrats, and some of them are labor organizers, but they are not people trained in the built environment and in spatial expertise. And because I've known some of them for a while, and some of my other partners have known some of them for a while, it's a thing we raised almost immediately with them. And they were very receptive to the idea that there is a huge built environment component to what it means to accomplish the 3 main goals of the Green New Deal, which are decarbonization, climate adaptation, and climate justice, and that they didn't have the people in-house to help them think through this. And because plan A for writing whatever we might think of as a Green New Deal was always to have a sort of select committee in the House that could compel expert testimony through subpoena power, people like Bob and others. And that would be used as the sort of way that they write whatever pieces of Green New Deal legislation are coming down the pipe. Because we didn't get that, Plan B became to do this sort of ad hoc process wherein that group of people, which is a half dozen or so members of Congress and a few people in the House and in the Senate, to reach out to people in a sort of ad hoc way to help them write individual pieces of legislation that are tied to the Green New Deal. And I'll talk about what that looks like in just a second. But I want to begin with the reference that the Green New Deal makes and talk about the New Deal for a little while, which for some of you in landscape and planning might feel like kind of a refresher or a planning history lecture or design history lecture, but it's quite important, mostly because I think so many people view the scale of the proposals put forward within the Green New Deal framework as just like wildly ambitious and unrealistic because we don't have the scale, size, authority, funding for the bureaucracy in this country that we think we need to do all of this. And that's certainly true, and if our view of like the future is that nothing will change between now and the imagined like end of the century in which a Green New Deal is fully built, then of course we can't do it. But I think part of the logic of the Green New Deal is that there are major interventions and expansions of the public sector that have to happen for us to accomplish any of these goals. And the New Deal is the last time in this country anyway that a coalition of social democrats and others were assembled for long enough and with enough ambition to pursue a truly transformative built environment agenda. And we'll talk about this in a second, but there's something like 15,000 built projects from the New Deal era, mostly from the WPA, the CCC, and a few others out there in the world. If you went to a public school at this university, I'm sure, although I should have looked at this, but I went to all of my K through 12, or my high school and college years in old WPA buildings. It's hard to find a place in this country that was not touched by the New Deal. And part of the logic of the Green New Deal, I think, is to find a way to touch the lives of every American again through major investments in the built environment. And this is a cartoon I've stolen from Nancy at places, which is beginning to look at sort of the first few months of the New Deal as it's pitched and the way that the FDR administration was thinking about it. These little bottles here, which I don't know, are like supposed to be, I can't tell if they're alcohol or medicine. I guess they're medicine. Maybe it was also alcohol back then. Trying to think about ways that different alphabet agencies could treat the ailments of the country. And so if you think about where the US was at this time, it's at the intersection of sort of three incredible crises. One was ecological, and it was the Dust Bowl and the forced migration of 3.5 million farmers from the Midwest, mostly to California, as the sort of farm belt there collapsed. A second was the financial crisis of the Great Depression, and a third was the sort of rising political crisis of fascism all around the world. And I'll come back to this later, but we find ourselves at a similar intersection today, and it's part of, I know, why the Green New Dealers have made this direct reference to the New Deal, is that we once again find ourselves living through, a moment of incredible ecological crisis in climate change, much larger than the Dust Bowl. We find ourselves once again mired in a kind of financial crisis in the hangover of the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009, from which most people who actually suffered during it have never recovered. And again, dealing with the rise of fascism all around the world, including in this country. And it's important to know, right, that I think one of the critiques that's been leveled at the Green New Deal is like, okay, we've all read HR 109, although I don't know if everyone in here has read it. This is the non-binding resolution in the House that kind of lays out the framework for a Green New Deal. But like, what are the details? What's your plan? Like, how is this going to get from, step one over here, which is dropping this non-binding resolution, to step 6,000, which is like the full-scale implementation of these major climate adaptation, decarbonization, and justice planks. And I suppose that's fair if it's like a criticism made in good faith. It just often is not made in good faith when you hear a criticism like that on Fox News. And it's important to understand the New Deal in this particular reference, that it was never an overarching plan. It was a series of improvisations held together not by theory but by strategy. And one of the things the New Deal tried to do was to transform the role of government from a sort of passive force that maybe provided funding, maybe set a few rules and standards, which is kind of how we think of it today, and to imagine it as kind of like the innovator-in-chief for the country and the experimenter-in-chief for the country, and to think about trying lots of things, knowing we had a certain point we needed to get to, which for them was pulling us out of the recession and accomplishing many, many other goals, and not really having an idea of how to get there, and trying whatever you thought might work, killing the things that didn't work, and scaling up the ones that did. And this is how the New Deal tended to unfold over the rest of the century. And for designers and planners in particular, this is from Phoebe Cutler's book, the public landscape of the New Deal. It's also important to know that this was probably the only moment in American design history in which the sort of tether between design practice and capital is even partially severed. So that means, like in this instance here, that most of these agencies created by the New Deal are employing tons and tons of planners and architects and landscape architects. And Phoebe's book is a really incredible accounting of that for landscape architects, but Nature's New Deal does this for planners and architects a little bit as well. There are several other books that try to capture that design history within the New Deal and offer it, I think, probably not then, but it's certainly relevant now as an alternative to the way that we think about the way design is practiced out in the world as an instrument and not an agent of power. And I mentioned, this is a project of a couple of former geography faculty members at Berkeley, Richard Walker, and I'm blanking on his colleague's name now, but it's a site called The Living New Deal. It's a thing every designer should probably spend some time familiarizing themselves with. I've zoomed out quite a bit here, so it's a little deceiving, I think, how clustered all of these projects are. But as I mentioned, there's a little over 15,000 now, kind of spread all over the United States. The transformation of the built environment from that era was so totalizing and complete that we often can't understand or can't recognize what has been changed by the New Deal today, because almost everything we know about the places we live and the places we go was transformed by it. I think the example designers tend to go back to the most is the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is interesting in many ways. I think at the time, right, this is the most centralized planning kind of attempt at controlling the way that energy is generated in the United States. This is kind of our first big experiment in public power, which is a term that's come up a bunch again now in the Green New Deal conversation. And the TVA is actually kind of a thing that people in that world point to as a failure, mostly because the TVA is one of our biggest users of coal. There are many reasons for that have nothing to do with who owns or doesn't own the utility, and actually how the board that controls the TVA is appointed, which is through presidential administrations. But the TVA is, its goal was to accomplish more than one thing with a single investment, which is how we have to start to think about the investments that might come through a Green New Deal. So this is in the 1930s in the rural South, when electrification is not a thing that most people had as a part of their everyday lives, certainly not in their homes. And the TVA's idea, the logic of the TVA was to use the dam and the creation of hydroelectricity as a lever for all kinds of other things, including rural economic development, including rural farm worker housing, and all kinds of other amenities that were built during the New Deal era, controlled by the TVA. And that we're looking here at the Norris Dam. This is one of the most immense, spectacular feats of engineering probably ever accomplished in this country, thinking about the way that, along with the Hoover Dam and some others that were built during this time. And they were built in this way, in very spectacular ways, very purposefully. Not only because they needed to build big, giant things to control all of this water and generate all of this electricity, but also because they wanted people to view these as attractions and to come spend time in them and get to know them and understand the impact of government in their lives as a force for good. And so when you go into a TVA dam, these are workers coming off the line here, helping to construct one of the dams. When you go into a dam now that's within the TVA system, you have all this propaganda, which is quite jingoistic and terrifying sometimes, but it's also a different way of thinking about how you demonstrate the value of government in people's lives in a way that we really missed in 2009 and 10 with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, what's commonly known as the Obama stimulus, where we got a bunch of cheesy kind of green signs around highway projects no one really wanted, and that was it. And the TVA dams have become some of the most visited sites in America. It's not just that people flock to Glacier and Yellowstone and the National Mall, although they do that. People actually also flock to the dam system that the TVA built. At its peak, shortly after it was constructed, the dams attracted just over 6 million people over the 1940s after World War II ended. They still attract hundreds of thousands of people a year today. And it's because they built things that power that region and also invite people to sort of wade around in the wonder of what the government was able to do when it thought big and took risks, which it doesn't really do anymore. And in addition to the TVA, we're looking now at a workers' camp for the Civilian Conservation Corps. One of the other things that FDR had to do, because he was dealing with 20% unemployment, was think about how you put people to work to accomplish more than one goal. So if we think about the jobs guarantee component of a Green New Deal today, this is where the CCC sort of comes in. And if you've read Jay Inslee's climate plan, which I'm sure you've all done because you're huge nerds like me, You know that he proposed a version of this, the Climate Conservation Corps, which has now become Elizabeth Warren's climate plan, and that particular item has become almost everyone's climate plan in the 2020 field. The CCC did many things. One of the things it did, along with the WPA, was build a lot of the sort of state park and other sort of natural-ish infrastructure we think of today and use. They built something like 8,000 state park facilities over the course of the New Deal, which is just under 90% of the total amount we have in this country today. They also planted about 3 billion trees, which is just over half of all the trees ever planted in this country by the federal government, all done in a few years during the New Deal. And the other thing they did, so when we hear about jobs guarantees and building all kinds of new housing, all kinds of new infrastructure, one of the things, I think one of the attacks or one of the criticisms that's often lobbed at that idea is this idea that we don't have enough people in the workforce with the right training to do that kind of work. And maybe that's true for some things, but what the CCC and WPA did particularly well was to give their sort of district chiefs, basically to tell them, this is your labor pool. This is what they can do, design projects that they can build tomorrow. We don't have time to retrain people because we need to put people to work doing lots of things. And we're not going to mechanize anything. Everyone's going to build most of this stuff by hand, so it's going to be very labor intensive because the whole goal is to put people to work, not to do things in a sort of neoclassical economic way of efficiency, but to put a lot of people to work. And to say, like, it's okay if you don't finish the drawings and they're not beautiful. We just want projects people can build tomorrow. And most of the work they did was done with picks and axes and shovels. This is them putting up light poles in the Tennessee Valley to power, towns that were newly powered by the TVA. We're looking here at some of the Greenbelt towns that were built as a part of the Resettlement Administration. So it gets quite confusing to think about all the different agencies that FDR created, but the sort of key ones for planning and design folks in the built environment world tend to be the CCC, the WPA, the TVA, and the Resettlement Authority. There are some other kind of permutations of each of those that come up. But we're looking at literal this is Greenbelt housing, which was built in places like Wisconsin and Ohio and Maryland. Those of you who've been to Greenbelt, Maryland probably know it's a New Deal era town. For me, for most people who've gone to a public university or land grant in the States, which is this one, and I'd have to check to make sure it's true of Rutgers, but for most, there are at least a few buildings, a few auditoriums, a few amphitheaters, a few other pieces of the built environment that were built by the WPA. This is my School of Architecture from undergrad. This is Volwacker Hall at the University of Arkansas. It also built almost our entire network of municipal airports. So just under 500 municipal airports built during the New Deal era by what would become the FAA. It was, I think, the Civil Aeronautics Administration at the time. It also, these things, because the New Deal invested in public art too, came with this beautiful propaganda. For folks who've flown through Chicago, you've probably been here. This is Midway, a New Deal era airport. Several of these have since been decommissioned. So Stapleton in Colorado is one, Mueller in Austin is another one, but many of these still operate today. And they did other massive things in the natural environment as well. This is the Blue Ridge Parkway. Some of you may have spent time on if you're outdoors folks. This is a rendering done of it going through North Carolina. And they also built these incredible pieces of civic infrastructure. So this is a joint sort of city council space, town. So it's essentially a city hall plus a library in Greenbelt, Maryland. And this is a bunch of guys. The CCC was mostly guys lowering trees into the ground here. And just as a sort of point of reference here, I didn't realize we'd have two screens. So it looks like 4 books, but it's 2 books. These are 2 that, at least for me, have become really important touchstones as I think about what the scale and scope and pace of transformation that the New Deal brought to the table are for planners and designers that are thinking about this stuff. One is Phoebe Cutler's book, which is about 35 years old now and is probably due for an update. Another is Amanda Colson Hurley, she's an editor at City Lab, the Atlantic's sort of urban property. And the book isn't exclusively about the New Deal, but because it touches on kind of experimental suburban life and housing, tends to have quite a bit of emphasis on a few of the Greenbelt towns and a few others built during that period. But of course, this story of the New Deal is quite romanticized and is only partial. And for those of you who were at the event, you heard Raj make this point much more, I think, compellingly than I can. But at that event, he made clear that this story of the New Deal is only partial. and comes at the end of a much longer and bloodier history and prehistory of the United States. It's a story of genocide of indigenous people. It's the story of land being made safe for commerce and finance and for stagecoaches and monopolies. And this is Raj here sort of giving his talk at our event about a month ago. And it's important, there are many ways in which I think we can link the history of the New Deal back to colonialism and back to slavery and back to Jim Crow. The most obvious of which is that FDR's New Deal coalition included the Jim Crow South. It would not have been possible without that. And as a result, you could go through and look through the actual employment records for things like the CCC and find that a tiny percentage of their workers were black or African American or non-white. And most of those folks were often asked to build things they were promised they'd have access to and then denied access once they were complete. So I don't want to sort of hold the New Deal up as like this holy shrine that we just have to figure out a way to replicate exactly as it was done, because it fucked up a lot of stuff. The New Deal was not perfect, but it was probably the best attempt in the United States at something like a national scale built environment transformation that's ever been done. And it's important for landscape architects and city planners too to think about this within our own sort of canon and the way we think about important figures in our field. This is from a piece that Zan Lillahai, one of my students, and I just published with the Scent magazine. So though American city planners and landscape architects often celebrate Olmsted's accomplishments, they rarely engage seriously with the ways in which he participated in these structures that Raj just highlighted for us of dispossession and racial violence. I think people very strangely tend to think of Frederick Law Olmsted as this huge social reformer who was really interested in abolition, although he wasn't, and that he accomplished many of the kinds of goals we might think of as being admirable today. And there's lots to admire about the built environment legacy of Frederick Law Olmsted, but we also have to remember this is an exhibition that just came down up at Harvard. The title was not How Landscape Architecture Hoped to Save the City. It was Big Plans Picturing Social Change, and it was holding up these great men in history who developed plans that changed the future, which is not how things have ever worked. Design is an instrument of power, right? Not an agent of power, and so the structure, the forces that structure the distribution of pain and pleasure in this country around the world are the things that guide what and how and where design gets to operate. I think to reverse that directionality is a huge mistake. And if you look at the history of Central Park, which is sort of Olmsted's crown jewel, or at least the first project we tend to reference when we think about him and when we think about the birth of landscape architecture in this country and we think about the evolution of the urban professions in this country. I guess we have to remember this is taken from a piece in the Times that just came out this weekend, that Central Park was only possible because of the eviction of Seneca Village, which was an exclusively African-American neighborhood in Manhattan. Olmsted wasn't the one who decided to evict them, but he decided it was cool to work on the project if they were evicted. And for folks who've paid attention, well, I'll get to this in just a second, but this is true in our nation's capital too. I think we think about it as sort of a monument to the promise of what American democracy can do, and also most of the place was built by slaves, especially most of the public buildings that we tend to think of as great works of American architecture or important works of American architecture. And this is, I'm pulling from Nancy here in a piece she wrote a couple years ago after Hurricane Sandy, and I think sort of capturing some frustration that many people in the design world felt about the sort of lack of what we now might think of as the Green New Deal sort of coming to the fore during the actual Great Recession of 09 and 10, that it seems increasingly clear that the Great Recession is not sparking a New Deal. And we confront our crisis in a political climate that's contemptuous to the very idea of the public. And Nancy here is talking about the sort of failure of imagination and ambition during the recession of the Obama administration, where I wound up working and where Bob worked, and I'm sure other folks in the room worked, to take on the crisis at the scale at which it was occurring, which then was a financial one, but also a climate crisis. We just didn't call it that back then. What we wound up doing with the $1 trillion or so we spent in the Obama stimulus in 09 and 10 was to spend about half of that on built environment interventions. And almost all of that half was spent on projects that were shovel ready, which I think is a thing that sounds great in theory, and led us to build a whole bunch of stuff that no one wanted. They were projects that had been sitting sort of on the books for 10, 15, 20 years and were ready to build because people had, I think, made plans to build them and then recognized they were terrible projects. And because they were the ones that were ready to build, were the ones we built. This is Varsh during the sit-in at AOC's office around the sort of beginning of the Green New Deal, along with AOC, and this is really the beginning of what Nancy's outlining in that piece in 2011, 2012. I think the moment they were waiting for came, almost a decade later. And Nancy goes on in a later piece to sort of say that can we imagine architects contributing to, maybe not leading, but contributing to a realignment of politics, a reinvigoration of public service, and a renewed commitment to the project management of the nation within this context of responding to the crises of our day, which I think Nancy viewed purely as financial in this piece, and which certainly are, but are also ecological in the climate crisis and political in the rise of fascism and the conservative movement. And I spend a lot of my time as we're starting, I'm going to slowly pivot to the Green New Deal, thinking about the 1960s as I think about this moment we now find ourselves in. So this is the first Earth Day in New York. This is the protests, 1970, which we're really coming up on the 50th anniversary of again. This is the climate march about a month ago, almost in the same spot of New York, which I think something like 1 in 1,000 people on the planet marched in somewhere around the world. I just got way louder. And I find myself thinking about it a lot, partially because we've been celebrating a book that was written in the 1960s by Ian McHarg, but also because that book came much later, after Rachel Carson and others sort of paved the way for him. And we hit the 50th anniversary of Silent Spring about 7 years ago. It was published in '62, I think. And the New Yorker put out, their retrospective on it. These are images taken from it. But this also happened to overlap with a second sort of opening or widening of ambition within the public sector that is also the sort of second reference point that Green New Dealers tend to make, which is around the moonshot. And this is JFK, I think 1962 at Rice University in Houston, giving his moonshot speech, which he says, "We choose to go to the moon this decade, not because it is easy, but because it is hard." And people tend to forget. I think I've heard other people also say that the moonshot was quite easy because all we had to do was build a thing to get to the moon, which sounds really easy right now because we figured it out. But when JFK made this proclamation, we didn't have not a single piece of the technology that was used to get us to the moon existed. He knew we had a point A and a point B and no freaking idea what the path was to get there. But he knew that through public procurement, through public investment, so public procurement, the purchase of things by governments through contracts, and the public investment in research and development, often at universities like this one, that we could figure out how to do it. Now, he had many reasons to go to the moon that have nothing to do with the environment or climate change. It was about the Cold War and other things. But the moonshot's often invoked because it's the last time that we really stood up as a country, as a government, and said there is a destination that we know we need to get to. We don't know what the path is, but we're going to throw everything we have into figuring it out. And it yielded many things for us going to the moon, one of which is this image of Earth, which is often called the Blue Pearl, that became central to Ian and his work. And this is his book, Design with Nature, in 1969, taking a version of that image and mirroring it on both sides. And this is Ian, he's somewhere in the crowd here. This is Philadelphia's Earth Day in 1970. And Ian really, in many ways, for folks who aren't familiar with the field of landscape architecture, I could talk for hours and hours about him, and you should have Kate do that because she just finished a book on just that. But Ian really is probably the central force that got landscape architects out of gardens and small parks and into larger scale thinking and the integration of things outside of plant biology into their practice. Other people were involved, but Ian and this book were really the sort of push that pushed the field out of these small scale, small impact projects into larger scale thinking and more complicated projects. And this is Ian, this is him coming to the mic at that first Earth Day and sort of bellowing with a thick Scottish accent, which I'm not going to try and do, saying, "Why do I have to be the one to bring you the bad news? You have no future. The nation's industries are the guarantee of your extinction." And Ian, I think for folks who know Kate Aronoff, who was one of our speakers at our event about a month ago, they would have gotten along great because she's the person who's sort of led the charge in saying that we should try fossil fuel executives for crimes against humanity. I think they would have had a lot to talk about. But Ian's also, he is really the person who is pushing the field to think more about where landscape architecture sits within the political economy of the built environment. That's happening in geography and other places in the 1960s. It is not happening in schools of design. It hasn't really happened to this degree since. And this is us looking at, as a part of his exhibition, looking at some of the work he did. So these are maps that he and his students used to draw by hand with markers up in their studio at Penn. This is pre-GIS. Ian and his sort of colleagues are sort of widely credited with creating what we now think of as GIS. Some of his former students have gone on to run some of the companies that operate GIS, like Esri. So this is Jack Dangerman and some other people. And they really began thinking, this is the whole Delaware Basin. So Philadelphia is down here at kind of the bottom right of these maps. Thinking about the ecological systems that they're trying to plan and design within. Now, Ian did many things outside of this kind of work that dealt directly with the political world. He sat on most of the White House task forces and commissions that were constituted during the 1970s, often by the Nixon administration, as we were passing the sort of first wave of environmental legislation in this country. So things like NEPA, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Wilderness Act, all of which came about during this time. Ian played a sort of central role in helping to shape, if not before, then after they were passed and as their administration became codified into government. And he was doing this while he's also in conversation with all of the sort of leading voices in design at the time. You can look at I'm not going to go through the whole list here, but you can see Louis Mumford, J.B. Jackson, Louis Kahn, Grady Clay, I think Jane Jacobs is in here, Kevin Lynch, I think Catherine Bauer is in here as well, yeah. Ian is really trying, I think for the first time, trying to assemble the collective expertise of the design world with the collective scientific expertise of the ecological world and inject them directly into the way that government functions around the creation of an environmental regulatory regime which had not existed pre-1970 in this country. And he's doing that while he's also sort of wading into the messiness of public debate and politics in other ways. This is him. He had a TV show on PBS, which is kind of wild to think about any designer out there in the world having a version of now, called The House We Live In. This was also the name of the sort of biographical exhibit that we mounted at Penn this year, where he invited every conceivable form of expertise onto his show to talk about the future of the planet. Sometimes they were environmental scientists, sometimes they were engineers, sometimes they were designers, sometimes they were theologians, sometimes they were philosophers. I think he had no qualms. He wanted to have as many discussions as possible. And people often ask, like, what happened? Why didn't we actually get to a point where we could design with nature? And this is where this gentleman comes in. As Ian's book is published in 1969, and he begins the process of sort of bureaucratizing and technocratizing the fields of landscape architecture and environmental planning. He also does so by placing a whole lot of faith in the rational planning method and the idea that data can move policymakers, that that's maybe the only thing we need to move policymakers. And as he's building up that bureaucratic apparatus with other people, he and the environmental movement sort of get cut off at the knees by the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. And what we've sort of come to think of as the end of design with nature. So if Ian's work begins at 1969, really ends in 1981, January 21st, I think, when Ronald Reagan is inaugurated. And it's important to think about, we think about that again today, because I sit in a school and in a field where I think urban science and urban data and big data have become sort of central to every conversation we have about climate and environmental change, all of which are really important. But I think it's quite naive to expect that those are going to be the things that move people like this to adopt or move on climate action the way we need to move. And I find myself occasionally frustrated with colleagues who invest a lot of their time in this. This is the Landscape Architecture Foundation's Landscape Performance Series. I love LAF. They do many amazing things. I don't think trying to compete with or trying to find ways to better model cost-benefit analysis on landscape architecture projects is going to get anyone anywhere. And I say that because one of Ian's legacies to us has been this sort of technocraticization of the design fields, and thinking about our work as somehow above or removed from the movement building world and the political space in which decisions are actually made. And it's led to some very notable absences within the design world from the environmental movement over the last 10 or 15 years. We're looking here at a picture from Occupy Wall Street in New York, where there were a couple of kind of crazy architects who've now become part of the architecture lobby there, but for which design schools had almost nothing to say. We're looking at pictures from Standing Rock, maybe the largest and probably most catalytic and indigenous-led environmental action of maybe the last 10, 20, 30 years in this country, where designers have also not been involved. And we're looking here at just one shot from a BLM protest, where again, a very small cadre of designers on their own had been involved, but where most practitioners and schools of design have sort of decided that their work is above or beyond or somehow unrelated from these social and structural processes of change that shape so much of the built environment around us. And in fact, many of them, because they view their work as apolitical and technocratic, spend their time doing shit like this, like trying to help build a border wall. And building detention centers, or building things that can be easily transformed into detention centers. And if you've been paying attention to the last week or so of Archtober news up in New York, this is AECOM, who some of you may work for, may have worked for, may be thinking about going to work for, who take hundreds of millions of dollars to build private prisons all over the world. And during their open house for Archtober, got rightly harangued by a group of protesters, most of whom are not designers, for doing that kind of work. This is MoMA, which just opened its newest edition, a 450 million or so edition in New York. I think it opened to the public yesterday, Monday, something like that. And which has members on its board who also make money off of private prisons and off of Puerto Rican debt, and who've been dealing with protesters, I think rightfully again, haranguing them for that arrangement. And these things happen because, you know, the hegemonic bloc in design is around elite institutions that view their work as apolitical or as technocratic or as creative, sort of lone genius kind of work, the way that design is typically conceived. And what design has to think about, designers have to think about, and this includes planning especially, is how we might think about building a sort of counter-hegemonic bloc that can oppose these elite institutions, and think about building modes of practice that are disconnected from capital in the ways that the design and the planning and design of the built environment was to an extent during the New Deal coalition. And I'm pulling here, this is, for folks who don't know Corey Robin, he's a political theorist at Stony Brook in Brooklyn. This is taken from a book he wrote called The Reactionary Mind, From Edmund Burke to Donald Trump, talking about the sort of totalizing victory of the conservative movement in the global north, or at least the west, over the last half century. And this is from a podcast he did about it, where he says, you know, they won, they privatized everything they could privatize, they deregulated everything they could deregulate, and now here we are, the conservatives, have picked every cherry off the tree and it stands there bare. And he's talking about this at, you know, shortly after the Trump tax bill, the $1.5 trillion or so tax bill that we weren't asked to help pay for or think about ways to pay for, passed, but just barely in the Senate. So they got 50 votes plus one. And I think Chris Hayes was asking him, like, how could they struggle so much to accomplish the only thing that they talk about? It's like the number one priority for a Republican administration is corporate tax cuts. And I think Corey's response was rightfully that it's because they're actually quite weak, because they've won every fight they've picked for the last 40 years. So if we imagine the world built by the New Deal from the 1930s forward as the sort of realization of a leftist sort of movement building power, coming to power, exercising its power out in the world, we can also imagine the sort of success of the conservative movement that was ushered in by Reagan as, you know, the culmination of that for the right, sort of building, seizing and execution of power by conservatives over the last 40 years. And what we see in the Green New Deal movement and from the broader left movement in the States that's now sort of simmering into being, we see the first sort of, I think, glimmers of what a sort of counter movement to that conservative hegemony could actually look like. And you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of prototypes that we've been thinking about for the Green New Deal first too. So in this exhibit, you know, we have 25 projects. I'm not going to go into anywhere close to all of them from all over the world. I think they're in 21 countries on 5 continents. You can go if you really want to see them and see them on the McHarg website. But there are a few that have been particularly, I think, compelling for us as we think about the way a Green New Deal might be structured. Because one of the things that's true about, I think, all of what the climate science tells us, and also what the folks who are doing movement building tell us, is that we don't have any time to waste. We have to do a whole bunch of shit really quickly. We have to build things better than we've ever built them, faster than we've ever built them. So we need ideas about where to start and what to scale up as quickly as we can. This is looking at Waiheke Island in New Zealand. Like many other islands, had huge sort of problems with the introduction of invasive species and plants and other things that were destroying the ecology of the island. Unlike most other islands, it's gone through maybe the most successful restoration and eradication program of any other, certainly in New Zealand and in most of the sort of southern hemisphere. But one of the most successful eradication projects is it's a 30-year project led by Dennis Scott and many other Kiwi landscape architects to go in and restore the ecology of Waiheke Island in New Zealand to a state it was sort of at pre-colonialization. And it's in here because we're going to have to unbuild things too. Maybe not quite as much in the way that Waiheke had to, and I'll talk about this more in just a second, but we're probably going to have to go in and unbuild some giant pieces of infrastructure. We've unbuilt a couple urban freeways in this country. We're probably going to have to unbuild more of them, and I'll talk about why in just a second. The second example, and I know Wolfram, who's sitting in there, knows this very well. This is Emscher Landscape Park in Germany in the Ruhr Valley. This is essentially Germany's Appalachia. So in the 1950s, 60s, as Germany is sort of beginning its transition away from coal, or at least thinking about it. Germany tends to be like 50 years ahead of us on everything, including like the rise of fascism. They're thinking about this region as like an opportunity to use landscape remediation as a form of economic development. So this is their heavy industry heart. They have about 800,000 people who live here. They have 3 universities that serve that whole area. Most people who live there, who are adults, don't have college degrees. They're working in either the extraction part or the coal fire part or the sort of transportation and logistics part of the heavy industry, the heavy energy industry. And so they have a lot of really heavily polluted sites. And so in Emscher, they have to think about how they use that massive sort of swath of toxic sites as a sort of and use the remediation of them as a sort of leverage point for catalyzing other kinds of investments. So, over the course of 20 or so years, through a concentration of resources and sort of national regulatory reform and some other things that Germany is able to do that the US has not quite figured out, they're able to go in and actually start remediating these sites, building institutions like universities, converting their old coal fire plants like this one into a trigen or a bigen plant that can produce electricity and other kinds of energy that are low or no carbon. They can take these heavily toxic sites. This is a former freight railway train platform, or it's going up to one, turn them into parks and other kinds of amenities that people can use and that are tied to other forms of private investment. This is a former coal fire plant or coal storage and coal fire plant that's been converted into a big industrial park essentially. And so this is the German example is a particularly interesting one when we think about like what a government can accomplish in about 10 years with a concentration of resources and a sort of reconfiguration of its regulatory framework. And one of the things Germany is able to do, again, that like we haven't quite figured out in the US, is how to have government lead the commercialization of new technology. So as they're transitioning these 800,000 people off of the sort of heavier, dirty energy industry and putting them into a sort of clean energy and advanced manufacturing economy and other kinds of things in their economy, Germany is able to own the first sets of factories, which allows them to then own the IP, which then allows them to continue to profit off of things after they allow the private sector to enter the market. So much of Germany's sort of solar panel manufacturing renaissance story can be told through the Ruhr Valley and through Emscher Landscape Park, and partially because their first round of investment there was in large-scale environmental remediation that made it possible to build parks and housing in places we didn't have parks and housing before. The next example is looking at Room for the River in Holland. So Holland sits at the sort of tailwaters of 3 rivers that drain almost all of Northern Europe, so they can't do a whole lot about their upstream problems, and they have a lot of downstream problems. And they also have they've done a lot of the things everyone else in the global north has done for the last 50 years, which is to channelize their rivers, to build a whole bunch of housing and other critical infrastructure alongside them, and then like freak out when those things collide and there's a flood. And like throw their hands up, like how could this happen? But because they're Holland and because they have a centralized government and because they tax people at a reasonable rate and they don't have the world's largest military by some order of magnitude, they're able to put money into things like this. So what they're able to do is to think about restoring floodplain function to their rivers by dechannelizing them strategically, not everywhere, but strategically, by expanding the channels they did have so that they could accommodate more floodwater, and by moving tens of thousands of people out of the floodplain and hundreds of millions of euro in sort of precision agriculture investment out of the floodplain. And we're looking at them sort of over time doing that in a particular region. So you can see kind of some of the investments that were made there. And I'm not going to talk about this one. This is Y2Y in Canada and the US. This is a big conservation plan, which we can get into in the Q&A if you want. But I want to talk now about the Green New Deal, because these are sort of the models. I've been talking about the New Deal for what seems like forever. And I want to talk about the Green New Deal, and I don't want us to run out of time. So who here has read HR 109, the non-binding resolution? A couple of you. So it's a really interesting document for lots of reasons. And for people in the built environment world, it actually has like a lot there for us that I don't know if we've talked enough about as a set of professions. So one of those is build resiliency against climate disasters. One is repairs and upgrades all US infrastructure. One is to hit a zero emission energy standard in every building in the United States. One is to build an energy efficient and distributed smart grid. One is to retrofit every existing building for maximum water and energy efficiency. And then there's like 14 others. So like no small feat, we just need like 10 years, we'll figure all of this out. I think that's like how it's been framed by some people. But I think the promise of the Green New Deal is to think about how some of these things that we already invest hundreds of billions of dollars in, or billions of dollars at least in every year, can be leveraged to achieve all of these other goals, and maybe with a little bit or maybe a lot bit more money, actually get us there at a timeline that is aligned with what the science tells us we need to do. So just to give you a sense of how this is from a project we're about to release in the McHarg Center. It's called the 2100 Project. This is the first part of it, called an Atlas for a Green New Deal. Just trying to spatialize and curate in one place a lot of the sort of climate and built environment data that's been important to us as we've assembled our Green New Deal policy shop. You're just looking at temperature increases. That's probably a map you know pretty well. This one might not be, or at least maybe you've never thought about it this way. So you probably already know Chicago is the highest heat mortality death rate city in the country. That's for lots of reasons. But by the end of the century, it'll have the same temperature profile as Dallas, Texas does today. So you can imagine that being a huge problem for the city, which is mostly, it's partially a social question, partially a built environment question. Those things are pretty hard to separate from each other. And I don't mean to, Bob is I think gonna murder me for showing this image here. And I don't mean to present this as this is what will happen, but this is using Matthew Howard's work, a geographer at the University of Georgia. He's really one of the first people to go in and try and count up how many structures will literally be underwater, and how many people live in those structures by different time horizons this century. And then using some other sort of demographic work that he's been doing, trying to figure out where those people might move. And this is just looking at the top 10 sort of out-migration cities in his model. As you can see, because we leave so much of this stuff to the market, most of those people are going to other coastal cities. So, if you move from San Mateo County to Miami-Dade County, that's probably not getting us very far. And because the United States has so thoroughly and totally demolished its public sector and neoliberalized the way that we think about the role of government and the role of the private sector, all of these decisions right now are mostly left to the market. And we're looking now at in-migration patterns. So you can see coming from all of these places, many people are still projected to move to these coastal locations. It's an open question whether they actually would if things get really bad, but that might not get really bad in time for people to actually make this choice. And this is kind of a weird map that maybe you've never seen. I like thinking about the Green New Deal in this context for a couple of reasons. One is that we have to have a plan for what we do. Every other country in the global north has what they might call national industrial policy, and many other things like a national plan, which is how they organize their resources, their sort of rulemaking and regulatory apparatuses around a set of shared national goals like decarbonization, like climate adaptation, often many, many other things around diversifying their economic sector and achieving other social goals. But we need one of those because there's a certain class of people in this country who already have climate plans for the end of civilization as we know it. You've probably seen articles about this out there that there's a segment of folks in Silicon Valley and just up the road in Wall Street who have purchased underground bunkers in New Zealand, who have jets sitting in hangars at all times every day, sometimes running, and that are staffed by paramilitary forces to usher them out of the country to their bunkers in New Zealand if and when the shit hits the fan. This is what their planes look like. This is from gosh, I can't remember the art. I think this is a New Yorker piece about it a couple years ago. There's this weird, I don't know if this GIF is going to play. Yeah, it's like this weird, there's a sheep here because it's New Zealand. I was just there like a month ago. There are a lot of sheep. I did not realize how many. These properties, no one knows exactly where they are. We're trying to use remote sensing right now to find them in like a little weird stealth project that one of my students and I are working on. It's quite hard. And you know, in addition to having these bunkers, they have these people sort of on retainer. This is Pinkerton. So for folks here who don't, I'm not going to go into like the long history of Pinkerton as like a force used to crush labor organizing in this country and a force to like operate as a paramilitary sort of service outside of government, but with the support of government. But they are those things. They still exist. And almost every major company in this country, and certainly every wealthy company in this country, has some arrangement with someone like Pinkerton to help them get out when the shit hits the fan for where they work. And that's all a long ways around to saying, like, these folks have plans. They are by and for elites, and we need other plans for other people in this country to think about how we deal with the climate crisis that are hopefully less dystopian than, like, bugging out to a bunker in New Zealand surrounded by a paramilitary force. We can't all do that. Probably shouldn't, no one should probably do that. This is one of the bunkers that exists right now in Kansas. So this is from Leah Stokes, who I think is coming to Rutgers next month, which is great. You should all go like meet and hang out with her at our event last month, talking about the sort of scale of the challenge before us now in a Green New Deal, just around electricity. And it's not just, so she's saying, it's not just that we have to essentially rebuild the entire electrical grid that we've spent the last 120 years building within the next 10 to 20 years, it's that we have to do it twice. And electricity is only 57% of the problem. Shit. She said shit much, like, I think louder and more emphatically than I did. And I gave this talk in a church once and felt really guilty about yelling shit, not realizing where I was. But you know, so part of what Lee is saying here, right, is that we have to do, like I said earlier, we have to build more things better and faster than we've ever done it before. And part of the reason we have to build such a large grid is because so much of this is predicated on electrifying like everything. So our cars, our appliances, all the other things that we might think of as gas or sort of fossil fuel powered now have to be brought onto the grid. That means the grid has to be much larger, both in capacity and physical space than the one we have now. Which looks, this is it. It took us 120 years to build it. Mostly it was done by the private sector and markets. We didn't have any real national environmental regulatory frameworks with teeth until about the 1960s, 1970s. So a lot of this is done by private companies, private utilities, and others. And as you can see, it's like a hot mess. I'm from Arkansas, that's like a thing we say. And as a part of this atlas, I'm not going to get into this weird like GIF, but we've been thinking about how to collect all of this kind of spatial, environmental, and climate information in one place and to compile and curate it in ways that can help us think through where and how and what the sort of built environment interventions that a Green New Deal could bring might be. I'm not going to get into details. These are pretty basic maps. These are ones you're probably all relatively familiar with. This is one that we built that is maybe less familiar. These are all the major landscape conservation efforts out there in the States right now. This wind potential map is probably quite familiar to you. But to get a sense, if we were to think about, without doubling the size of the grid, just taking the amount of electricity we generate per person now, without putting cars and appliances online, if we were to power that entire system through wind, this is the amount of land area we'd need. The blue there is for 100 million people, which is about how many the census thinks we'll have by 2060. The rest is for the 320 some odd, 330 some odd million people we have now. This is true for the solar industry as well. If we're to think about like the amount of land area we need, it's quite large. This is how I got to understand what like a Tesla power pack is, which I didn't quite know. It's a you know, an electric storage battery essentially. That's Elon Musk. We snuck in there to that rendering, who's I think not proud Penn alum. And then thinking about like what the other things are that are going to require space and land and other bits of this sort of built in natural environment agenda for a Green New Deal. We're not at the proposition phase. We're putting out kind of an atlas. But looking through, this is a report, an article that was out in Nature a couple months ago about the potential of trees to sort of, you know, be an instrument for carbon sequestration. I think the science on that is like very much out. I think we've way overpromised and underdelivered on the power of trees to handle this piece of the problem. But even if we take that particular analysis at face value, this is where, you know, they imagine the highest potential zones being. This is the amount of land we would need to actually decarbonize just what's already put out every year by people, not to take carbon out of the atmosphere. that's already there, which we actually are going to have to do since we're over 400 parts per million. We need negative carbon capture and technology as well. This is, as you can imagine, we're starting to think about like layering these things on top of each other. That's like a whole lot of damn land, not all of which can like be in the same place. And if you look at the IPCC's recent land report, which sort of spells this out in pretty dire terms, we're going to need lots of land for lots of these, for lots of purposes that cannot be coupled in the same place. One of which is probably going to be desal, and we're looking at the potential there. And this is the land area you'd need to actually accommodate the amount of water we need if we moved everything over to desal, which we're not going to do, but we're trying to, I think, make the case about how much land all of these things is actually going to require. And if looking at, this is, the number of Olympic-sized swimming pools, which I wanted to put Michael Phelps in there, but I think that's Elon Musk again. My students don't always listen to me. This is, it's 13,000 or so Olympic-sized pools. And then also thinking about like the softer effects, so not just the sort of spatial transformations that we might need, but for those of you who've read David Wallace Wells' like quite dystopic and I think troubling and problematic book, The Uninhabitable Earth, The Uninhabitable Earth, these are the studies he's pulling from, I think, to make his arguments about how bad things could actually get. So we're looking here at the total economic effects. Brown is bad, sort of orange is quite well, like he's going to do just great, I think, in climate change. And part of the reason for that is that the agriculture industry in this country will be completely reorganized by the shifts in technology and for the military and for other sort of single employers to leave those places. We know how bad it can get when that happens. We also know how bad it can get when an industry that's monopolized like agriculture senses an opportunity to open up new markets in places like the Great Plains, which the energy industry has done with fracking already. And I'm not going to get into these various disasters. This is just a sampling anyway. But one of this is really drawn from the Places piece, but I have the dissent credit in here with Zan. One of the arguments I've made in the Places piece that I think was passed around as part of this lecture is that we've reached the limits of what we can do, not just through project-driven development, but I think through this model of private sector-led everything. And the analogy I've started to make, right, I'm used for SAT nerds in here, which I don't know if that's anybody in here. I loved the analogy part of that test when I was taking it. I tend to think about this as like, so capitalism is to climate change what guns are to gun violence. And I don't know of any other field in which we would look at the sort of causal mechanism of a problem, which is capitalism. It is the causal force, along with colonialism and all the things that are embedded within it, in the problem of climate change. I don't know how we can seriously expect markets and capitalism to solve the problem it is creating. Even though I'm from Arkansas, and there are people there who I think would tell you that guns are the solution to the gun violence problem. I don't think anyone who's actually studied the issue would tell you that that's true or believe that that's true. And so we have to think about like how we're going to order all of this massive, to the extent that we can, all of this massive built environment transformation that's going to take place whether we want it to or not in this country anyway. So we're looking on the right at these projected migration patterns as a result of sea level rise. I think there are all kinds of questions we could raise about the model itself, but it's probably the most conservative estimate because it's just trying to account for people whose homes will be underwater by the middle or end of the century. We know lots of other people are already being displaced for other reasons related to climate change, and that's only going to increase. And if we take that sort of basic conservative estimate, we know we're going to have to build, looking at New York at the top, Chicago in the middle, Phoenix on the bottom there. We're going to have to build, that many of those kinds of cities to accommodate just the 100 million people we'll add by sort of natural in-migration and birth rate growth in this country. It's not accounting for the 13 plus million people who are going to be on the move as their homes go underwater. And we can leave all of this stuff up to the market, and if we do, we know how it will turn out. People with means will do fine, and people without them will be crushed. Or we can think about what a sort of built environment agenda for a Green New Deal could mean, and how you could center not just adaptation and decarbonization in it, although we have to do those things, but how you center climate justice as a part of that solution as well. And so this is, really quickly, I'm going to talk about some of the stuff that we're doing in this space. So this is a report I did not work on, but we're working on versions of this now with a group called Data for Progress and with several members of Congress. This one is tied to AOC's office. So what they're trying to do now is to think about what the sort of first wave of Green New Deal legislation will be for specific industries. So the first one that'll hit will be around public housing. This is part of why you're starting to see a lot of research and other kinds of activity around public housing. And we're now, so this first wave of housing work will really drop, I think, at the end of this month into early November. And then we've sort of begun to think about what the next wave of built environment work might be for us. One of the propositions we've been playing with has been to propose something like a 10-year moratorium on new highway construction. We spend about $50 billion a year or so building new highways that we can't maintain, that are super carbon intensive to build, that generate new VMTs for every lane mile we build, which also, even if we electrify all of our vehicles, will take quite some time and generate more CO2 along the way. And couldn't we spend those $50 billion a year or more in a world in which the Green New Deal is bringing all kinds of new resources to bear on building the freeways built during urban renewal that destroyed low-income communities of color and giving the land back to them, cooperative ownership or public ownership that decides what happens to them, and building an actual and functioning public and low or no carbon transportation system in this country. So we're just sort of kicking off those bits of research now with Data for Progress and all the partners you see here and a few others. And I want to return to David Oswald's quote here for a second, because I think much of that book is a problem. This quote in particular, I think, because it's the first one in the book, is especially a problem. I don't think the environmental movement has gotten very far with sort of disaster porn and the apocalypse. And I actually think the logic of the Green New Deal is that things can't be perfect, but they can be better than we think. And so I was talking about transportation, but I also think this is our attempt to begin to collect all of those big New Deal programs and other big built environment programs into one space in the U.S. Part of that atlas will release here in a couple weeks. And part of the justification for that, I think, has been to say that we've done big things like this before. Design hasn't been central to the sort of leadership of that. I think we've always been pushed to do it by movements. That's happening again. And I think the Green New Deal offers an opportunity for designers to think about how they radicalize their work in this way once more. And almost predictably, and I'm almost done, I promise, our institutions have not been particularly good or receptive to this. So for folks who read that Places essay, I got to a little floor fight with the ASLA president about the Green New Deal a few months ago, almost a year ago now. Partially because they, at the time, had nothing to say about the Green New Deal. For reasons that are totally understandable. ASLA's membership is mostly sole proprietors who are relatively conservative, or at least, I think, don't think about their work as particularly political. And because of that floor fight and some other pressure, they felt compelled to put out this statement, which they would have been better off saying nothing, probably, because the statement was the kind that you write that makes absolutely no one happy. It didn't really endorse the Green New Deal. It just said we already do this work, we're good. And then it also said there are specific provisions in it about social justice that we can't touch because we're designers, which is probably the exact wrong thing you could say about that particular piece of legislation. AIA, I think kind of deftly sees the Green New Deal as a jobs opportunity for architects. I don't think they are particularly interested in anything else. I think they think oh, this is going to lead to a lot of work for design firms, which is still better than ASLA when they think about how this stuff actually works. And it was part of our, I think this led us in many ways to start thinking about this event as an intervention within the School of Design at Penn, within the university, which has a very troubled set of politics itself. Penn is not a particularly progressive place when it comes to most things, especially climate and social justice. And within the built environment professions, which I think there were many, many, many people who I think were eager for something like an excuse to get interested in and involved in the Green New Deal, and this event became that for them. So of the 1,400 people who were there, probably half were planners and designers from all over the country. We had people flying in from California and Washington, which is, you can say what you want about people flying across the country for an event about the Green New Deal, but was really remarkable, and not the kind of thing that usually happens for a conference at the university. And with that, I just want to say that, getting to do this kind of work has been really, really exciting for lots of reasons. One is because it's probably, I've spent time in government and in administration. I've spent time doing movement building work as an organizer. I've spent time doing sort of applied research now at a center and other places in academia. And this is probably, it feels like the first moment in which there is actual momentum and real compelling ideas that are at the scale of the problem of climate change in a way that a carbon tax just isn't going to do for us. And so with that, like, I'm really eager to have like a conversation. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about the work we're doing in the Green New Deal in general, and I just want to thank Bob for having me. So thank you.
Thank you, Billy. We have about 15, 20 minutes available for questions. Comments?
So I was just curious as to how you transition from landscape architecture to more political work. Like, what inspired you to allow yourself to become politicized?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to like position this so you can actually hear me, which I'm realizing you probably couldn't for after that. So there's a few things. One is I grew up like in public housing in Arkansas, in rural Arkansas. Nobody in my family went to college. So I'm a first-gen low-income grad, and I think like even though there weren't really like a lot of political conversations in my family growing up, and I think really in 2008, that Barack Obama was probably the first Democrat my father ever voted for. I think like I lived through some of this stuff in ways that like a lot of people in the design world have not. Design is a very elite classist place. It's not true everywhere, but it's especially true at Penn and Harvard and some of the other places within our field. And there's a reason why, you know, a lot of folks who find their way into architecture, landscape architecture, have parents or family members who were there. We tend to think of the fields as, if not elite themselves, then like serving elites. And so I think there's not a lot of class analysis in landscape architecture, and that's always been a part of my life. So I think that was always like at the front of my mind, thinking about like every project I did as a student and as like a young practitioner, from like parking lots to parks to like housing developments, was like, where's the class analysis in this? And it just so happened that as I was finishing school and about to go take what turned out to be like a very shitty job in a design firm in Arkansas, shortly before that, Barack Obama did one of his first kind of like breakout speeches in Iowa in 2007. And this is at a time when like no one wanted to work for him. So he was struggling to raise money and to field staff and all that kind of stuff. And after he gave that speech and kind of got onto my like personal radar, some friends and I piled into a car to go hear him speak again a few weeks later in Waterloo in Iowa. And I left that event like as energized as I think I've ever been, and optimistic as I've ever been, and grabbed the organizer who was, you know, overseeing the event and said, like, if there's ever a chance to like work for him on this campaign, like tell me, I'll do anything. They're like, oh, it just so happens like no one wants to work for us. So, I mean, I didn't say that, but like, not that many people want to, and we've never met someone from Arkansas. So like, you're like, basically like you're hired. I mean, it happened a few weeks later, but I went to work as an organizer on the campaign, wound up taking almost a year off school to do it, staying through, you know, the primary in the general that he went on to win, and then going back to finish school, going on to take this like shitty design job. And as I'm like in this job, thinking about how much I hate it, I'm like working too much, not getting paid very much, terrible benefits. It's like a really oppressive, like, but also typical workplace for young designers. You know, part of design education is about like, I think conditioning you to be a contingent worker for a long time. It's like long hours, low pay, low benefits. All that kind of stuff is like beaten into you over the course of the way that you move through the design system from like first year into like your professional life. Those are things we have to probably change. But so as I'm like in this job, which feels like drudgery, one of my friends who's at the White House at the time, now he's gone with the administration, says like, we have a job that's open that I think would be good for. You were on the campaign, so you're like already in the system, so just apply for it, we'll talk. And it turned out that I got it. This is happening like as I'm also applying to graduate school and getting in and starting graduate school. So I'm at the University of Texas when I actually finally get offered the job. Fritz Steiner, who's now my dean at UT, or now my dean at Penn, was my dean at UT at the time, and was very, very gracious about helping me figure out a way to like finish mostly remotely. I had to come back for some exams and some other things, but I was able to go and stay on through re-election, which like was a really rewarding experience. I think like many other people who either went or like thought about going with him to DC, like there were many things that were disappointing about the administration, which I think we have a chance to do something about now through something like the Green New Deal. But I mean, that was how. I mean, I think like I was, because like I'd lived my whole life in precarity, was like totally fine taking a campaign job that also didn't pay anything, but like felt like more fun than the drudgery I was doing in my design job. But I also never thought I would stick around in the organizing world. I thought I'd do it for the campaign, go back and just like be a landscape architect forever in one of those kinds of offices. And I think like, you know, I've bounced around in many different ways through most of my professional life, partially because landscape architecture has always felt like kind of a tough fit for me. So when I'm here, I feel out of place. When I'm in like the political world, I feel out of place as a designer. So like I just am always constantly trying to like figure out where I fit in there. And it means that I wind up bouncing around a lot between the two and trying to do, I think, the opposite of what I'm like hired to do. So when I'm in the design world, I'm doing like a lot of political work. When I'm in the political world, I'm doing a lot of design work. Eventually, I think I'll find a place where I get to do like both in equal measure, but it hasn't happened yet. Yeah. Let's see. There's 1, 2, 3 back there.
I have 2 questions. They involve softball and hardball in the climate change world.
Okay.
The softball question is, until the young people vote out the politicians who deny climate change, or even more softly, who just don't want to do anything for whatever reason, how do you convince the voters in those states that are voting in politicians who don't want to do anything, that this would benefit them, that if they don't do something, it will get worse, at a level that they would understand? So that's my softball question. That's working in a positive way.
Can I answer that first, and then we'll do like the hardball question?
Yes.
Yeah. So, well, yeah. So I think that's actually like quite a hard question. But this is where the New Deal reference is really, I think, important and instructive. So one of the things FDR did with the first wave of investments in the built environment and elsewhere with the New Deal was to like put all of that money in the places like states and counties that hated him the most. So we thought a lot about political economy and political coalitions he would need to build like a durable and lasting New Deal. You can imagine like him taking a very different tack where he just sent money to like the people who got him into office, and the New Deal collapsing a year or 2 into his administration. And instead it carries on for almost 10 years, partially because he thought about like how you win people over by not just telling them, but by showing them the benefits. So I think this is like where we had a huge missed opportunity with ARA, with the Obama stimulus, was to show people the value of massive government investments. Although even that investment was not anywhere near the scale we needed. And it's a thing that Obama and his team knew at the time, but like they needed to put a lot more into sort of stemming the Great Recession, but for political reasons chose not to. This is again like where we have an opportunity through a Green New Deal to really show people the value of a strong, active public sector that imagines itself as a force for good in people's lives. It might mean that, like, you know, I'm from rural Arkansas, so I spend a lot of time back there. I'm going back in about 2 weeks, actually. And I'm increasingly doing a bunch of rural community and agricultural related research around climate change. And, like, we don't give people living in that world enough credit. Like, they get it. Like, much better than my neighbors in Philadelphia who, like, don't think about climate change on a daily level. Because like they're in their 4th or 5th year of getting little or no crop yields. They've been dealing with flooding and heat and drought and like everything you can imagine as a result of climate change. They're doing that like as the price of equipment has gone way, 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 way up because of Trump's steel tariffs. And so like we're going to lose whatever generation of small family farms are left. Most, there aren't that many left. Most are part of the sort of like everything else, like part of the consolidation of the giant sort of agriculture industry. But like they get it at a visceral level in ways we don't give them credit for. And that like if we paid them to grow and do other things as a part of the Green New Deal would like, and paid them like, you know, what their value actually is as opposed to like what we think the market will bear for some of these crops. You know, that's one way you can think about winning over people we might not imagine as part of our coalition today. I think they're waiting to be peeled off and to come with us. And this is true also for like many small and medium-sized communities along the coast, and the Gulf Coast, and the sort of lower mid-Atlantic, where like sea level rise is just like a part of their everyday life, where like there's sunny day flooding, you know, tens or dozens or hundreds of days out of the year, depending on where you are, and where like they don't have the resources or the attention or the political capital of a New York or a Miami or a Norfolk or a New Orleans. And like they know they have to get their shit sorted around climate change and have no access to the money and technical expertise they need, and will only get that through a massive infusion of federal money and technical assistance. And they might not talk about climate change the way that like I or Bob or other people might. They might call it nuisance flooding or like sunny day flooding, or just like say that, oh, it floods a lot more than it used to, we're not sure why. But like they also get it. Like we don't give them enough credit for like understanding the position they're in and being ready to be brought along if only we treat them like the frontline communities that they are. So that's one answer.
Hardball question.
Yeah, how's it going to get worse than that?
Well, that's good, that's good. Hardball question. We are in a situation where we're still not getting the voting for doing climate change activity at the national level that we need. Should we get a Democratic administration, they can, through executive orders, or if we had all three chambers, we might be able to do something, or the two chambers of Congress and the administration. But for those states, communities that vote against doing activity, if we told them you have a time limit to start to have your legislators do what's needed, or you won't be getting the same level of aid should climate disasters occur, or it'll be capped at a certain level. Feasibility for that, not worthwhile, just your thoughts.
Can you tell me what the question was again?
Excuse
Is that
me?
a good strategy?
Is what to just
Is that a reasonable strategy? Could it be implemented? Is it too much hardball?
I mean, is what it was to like tell
It
people
won't
who
bail you out if you,
Well, let me rephrase it. It's a good point. The level of bailout won't be at 100%. It might only be at 50% or 70%. And those municipalities, states would have to self-insure. In other words, it goes into their pocketbooks, so a little bit more heavily.
Yeah, I mean, being punitive is certainly one approach. I don't know if it's the one I would necessarily advocate. I think there are ways you can compel behavior from municipalities and states. You might think of them as like carrots and sticks from like a sort of policy design perspective. But I think this is one area. Even though I think of Obama's sort of Race to the Top initiative around education is like a huge problem in many ways, but it was trying to accomplish goals around charterizing and privatizing public school systems and doing many other things. It also was really creative, I think, in like thinking about setting a set of goals, having a relatively small pot of money attached to them, and saying like, send us your best ideas for how you might accomplish these, and we'll go off grant money appropriately. You could do that at a much larger scale for many, many other places if you had national standards that people were compelled either, by force or by sort of financial carrot to adopt. One of them is just really simple, just something really simple like, the energy code from 2017 that states don't have to adopt to like get their building industry to a zero carbon or net zero carbon standard. Some states adopt it, most don't because it's kind of hard and expensive to implement, but if we gave people money to do it and said all of the money you get from DOE, from HUD, from EPA is contingent upon your adoption of these things, that would compel the kind of behavior you're talking about in ways that aren't punitive and don't say like, well, you don't want to do it, fuck you. Like we could do that, but I think like that's only going to make things much worse for us. Yeah.
So we have time, I think, for a couple more questions. I mean, we can get one from a student.
I saw some over there, yeah.
Hello. You talked a little bit about capitalism and how that basically links into climate change, and that comes a lot from, I would say, there's a need issue, just like medical health, things like that. How do we decouple sorry, just like hearing my own voice is weird. Decouple need from the system, and how do you get that things that we need out of the market, like these projects?
How do we get need for what out of the market?
Well, so when people are beholden to the market for things that they need, it kind of means they'll pay whatever they can to get it.
Yeah.
Which makes it unsustainable and unresilient, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, look, like, money won't solve everything on the public sector side, but it'll solve many things. We've starved, the federal government of resources and authority for the better part of 50 years in this country. A lot of these problems can be taken care of by giving it more power, giving it more money, and I think, like, then it's a conversation about, like, statism and the design of states and bureaucracies, and, like, there are lots of like very problematic ways that could go. There are also like many people have been thinking about this for 30, 40, 50, 60 longer like periods of time. And like we have good ideas about what public ownership and public institutions can look like that can oversee or manage some of these processes in ways that markets cannot. Part of it also probably requires like changing the way that federal agencies think about how they measure performance, or like the sort of program evaluation side of the way, say, the Army Corps thinks about prioritizing projects. You know, they use a national economic benefits standard that really only captures things like commercial benefits and costs. We probably have to change that if we're going to be serious about climate change, unless, of course, we want the Army Corps to continue building levees to open up suburban development that then gets flooded when the levees that we built can't be maintained and they flood, which is the typical model for how the Army Corps does a lot of this stuff. They do other things too, but you know, part of it is about changing the actual like rules and regs that govern the way these agencies work. Part of it is about, I think, changing norms, and that probably means bringing new people who aren't only economists and lawyers. Economists and lawyers are great, but we need other people in government besides them. And also like expanding, I mean, Bob and I talked about this a little bit, you know, when he was at EOAS, like one of the problems with implementing RO is that they had a huge influx of money and no additional staff were hired to help them manage and administer the money. So it's going to require that we hire a lot more people into public service, and that in the design fields, in landscape architecture, city planning, that like going into federal government and state government and public service in general is treated like as a thing that's as venerable as going to work in field operations or SCAPE or like one of these other like sexy design firms. That actually like the scale that we all say we want to achieve through design is really only possible in that policy space. It's not possible in a project-oriented design firm. And so we have to treat them as like a destination that's worthy of us, like, you know, venerating in the way that we put like sexy magazine covers with cool projects together for LAM and for other publications.
Thank you.
That's all I'm about. Yeah.
Okay, sneaky last question, because it really has at least two parts. The first is, I've been thinking about your argument that how can the problem be solved by capitalism? Capitalism is chiefly driving the problem. This is a longer question than you can answer, but what I heard wasn't really a story of capitalism causing the problems. It was about how the state can solve the problems, especially when we think of the fact that if you look at the Soviet Union, if you look at other state, you know, at other communist industrialized societies, you see a lot of the same patterns of destruction and GHG output. So just some thoughts about, okay, so the solutions are around, you know, state intervention at a massive scale. And so the second part is, I can't see what the link is, but maybe you can, so I'd like to hear about that, is about the design with nature piece. Because you haven't been able to investigate that as much in your talk, and I wonder if there's anything sort of essential about the design with nature as being the solution, and if you would like to articulate that. Can't resist a footnote, but to say that in terms of where we see innovative solutions, that municipalities and states and smaller organs have really been doing a lot of the innovating. So anyway, that was a lot. Thanks.
Yeah, you know, I think that last point is especially true, but it's also partially because there's been no federal action, right? So it's easy to be a climate leader when the bar is on the floor, you just have to step over it. I think, you know, for many of these things, especially around decarbonization, you know, the technology is mostly there. So there are things we don't know how to decarbonize yet, like steel and concrete and other things that are going to require R&D. But to get us to zero carbon transportation outside of maybe air travel, which is a tiny, tiny fraction of the portfolio, it's like single percentage points, like 7%. Like that's just a deployment problem. So that's about like land use conflicts, local planning culture, and like the ability to build trust as you shepherd projects through the project delivery pipeline. The same is true for decarbonizing housing. We don't need like any new technology or innovation around decarbonizing housing. That's a materials question. That's like a passive housing standards question. That's a procurement question. Those are all things that can only be done through government. I think some cities and some states, which I'm including in this sort of bundle of government here, have really led the way on this, and it's like time to scale that up. Some of which is captured in the Energy Code of 2017, which I mentioned a moment ago that we could compel states to adopt and get us a lot of the way there. And the same, so if you think about like those three big sectors, electricity, housing and transportation, which I think get us to something like 85 or 90% of the emissions that we'd have to actually achieve, we'd have to actually zero out to get to net zero. Most of the tech is there. Not all of it, but most of it. And then it's mostly, like I said, a deployment question. And that's about like making the process of building projects much faster and easier and attuned to these particular challenges or the goals of a Green New Deal. This is where something like federal industrial policy can really, like, not just say we're going to hand all the keys or all the reins over to the public sector, but we can drive whatever the private sector does through all of these tools, some of which are around grants and contracts, some of which are around procurement, some of which are around the other levers of government that aren't necessarily like the obvious things we all think about, to drive the private sector in a particular direction. And it might be, if we think it's really important to decarbonize steel or heavy industry, that might be where we put money, or we sort of do big procurement orders that allow us to do that kind of thing. But anyway, so I think that's one. I also think, it's easy to point at the Soviet Union and other places where, statism has failed. That was a very particular kind of statism, which is probably not one that's been talked about as being replicated in the Green New Deal. But there are other places that have done this much better and are probably closer to the model other people have actually floated for a Green New Deal that come from parts of Europe, like Germany, come from Scandinavia, come from other parts of the world. What was that?
But still have capitalism.
In some form, yeah. And I'm blanking on the second question.
The design of nature, how is that linked? Is that linked to the cause? Is it essential to the solution?
So, there's a couple of links, I think. One is that, I think we're getting to a point where we're talking about national meaning again, and it's hard to do that without thinking about Ian's work around design of nature, which is really the first sort of intervention in the 20th century that pulls landscape architects, especially in some environmental planners, out of the smaller project scale work they were doing into larger multi-government, multi-state, mega regional kinds of projects. So thinking about how we might actually execute national scale or even mega regional scale projects again, I don't think it's possible to do that without thinking about Ian's contributions in that space. Many other people have made them, in that lineage since, and it's important to, I think, turn to those as we go forward. But the other, I think, is just learning. It's not necessarily about replicating what Ian did or wrote about in Design with Nature, because much of it, I think, has either been completely baked into what we do in the planning and design world now, like suitability analysis is something you do on every design project, or if you will, for the rest of your life, just about, with a few exceptions. But it's about, I think, learning some of the lessons that Ian got wrong. I think Ian's faith in the ability of sort of the technocracy and rationalization to solve all of these problems for us was really misplaced.
If I could just, not to take you off, but I meant designing with nature, not just the book, but that sort of strategy. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. Look, I think we tend not to think about it because it's been left up mostly to markets to do this, but the planet's already been designed. We have designed the planet several times over. We're going to do it again, whether there's a Green New Deal or not. And the only way we're going to do that well and actually achieve the goals of a Green New Deal is if we think about how we attune all those activities to the goals that I think, maybe not everyone shares, but that are shared by people who care about climate change and climate justice, which are decarbonizing things or mitigating and adaptation and hopefully climate justice as well. And how you think about designing the planet around those is going to depend, I think, a lot on whether or not you leave those kinds of forces up to the market only, up to the state only, or up to some sort of assemblage of those things. I obviously have a very strong opinion about where that balance probably lies. But I also think, like many other places, if you look at like Vienna in Austria, which is probably one of the only cities that's had almost unbroken social democratic rule for the better part of 100 years, really about 70, 80 years now. They also have 30% of the city in completely publicly owned housing. They have another third of the city in cooperatively owned housing, so part public, part people who are living there paying in and getting money on their way out, and about a third in market rate housing. And I think one of the myths that conservatives like to say about what a world would look like built by either a Green New Deal or by leftists in general is that we build a bunch of gold gray boxes where things don't work well and no one's happy. But if you actually look at the world being built by conservatives, that's what they're building. In the places where conservatives have and have had power, that's the world they're building. Vienna is both one of the most just places in all of the world, and one of the most beautiful because they invest a lot of public resources in public housing. They're some of the most beautiful Karl Marx Hof is the one that everyone points to, but all of the Hofs in Vienna are really spectacular works of architecture built by master-fast people who are unionized and paid well for their work, and so the work they do is beautiful and lasts for a very long time. And the housing itself houses not just native Vienna folks or Austrians, but also the huge now immigrant population coming into Vienna and their social housing program. So I think, like, you know, it's easy to, again, to point to some of these sort of failed examples of either social democracy or democratic socialist rule, but we also have many good ones to point to. And the argument that was made at this conference about the New Deal era was that when you looked around in the 1930s, it was hard to find an example of a sort of liberal democracy governed by markets that was working well. And that the New Deal was in part conceived not as a sort of socialist intervention, but as a social democratic intervention to save capitalism from itself, which is really what the New Deal did. I think there was an open question about whether the U.S. would remain a capitalist country as the New Deal was being formulated. And whether or not, like, we get to that question again in the States, I think we can also look around the world and find that there aren't many, if any, well-functioning liberal democracies built and organized around markets only or capitalism. And that it's probably time to ask ourselves whether or not the future we want or the world we want to build could be built through systems that have produced the one that's now failing us.
Let's thank Billy again for